December 1945. Heidelberg, Germany. The hospital room was quiet, smelling of antiseptic and wet wool. General George S. Patton lay in a traction frame, paralyzed from the neck down. His neck had been broken in a freak low-speed car accident, a collision with a truck while on a pheasant hunting trip. General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood by the bedside. He looked down at the man who had been his best friend, his worst nightmare, and his sharpest sword. Patton's blue eyes, usually burning with manic energy, were dim. "Ike," Patton whispered, his voice a rasp. "This is a hell of a way to die." Eisenhower forced a smile. "You're not going to die, Georgie. You're too tough for that." "Don't lie to me," Patton snapped, showing a flash of the old fire. "I'm finished. I was supposed to die by the last bullet of the last battle. Instead, I'm dying in a bed like a cripple." Eisenhower didn't know what to say. For 3 years, he had managed Patton. He had saved Patton's career half a dozen times. He had shouted at him, demoted him, and used him. "Ike," Patton said, his eyes locking onto Eisenhower's. "Did we beat them?" "We beat the Germans, George." "Yes." "No, Patton breathe. I mean, did we win? Or did we just trade one tyrant for another? The Russians, Ike. We should have kept going. We should have pushed to Moscow." Eisenhower stiffened. This was the argument they had been having for months. "George, the war is over," Eisenhower said firmly. "We are not fighting the Russians." Patton closed his eyes. A single tear leaked out. "Then we lost," he whispered, "and you will live to regret it." Eisenhower walked out of the hospital room into the cold German rain. He didn't know it then, but those were the last words he would ever hear George Patton speak. But the conversation wouldn't end there. It would haunt Eisenhower for the rest of his life. Flashback, July 1943, Sicily. To understand the admission, you have to understand the burden. Eisenhower was the supreme commander. His job was to hold the alliance together. He had to keep the British happy, the Americans aggressive, and the French from mutinying. He was a juggler walking a tightrope, and George Patton was a bowling ball thrown at his head. In Sicily, Patton was conquering the island faster than anyone thought possible. He was racing Montgomery to Messina, driving his men relentlessly in the heat. Eisenhower sat in his headquarters in Algiers, reading the reports. "He's done it again," Bedell Smith, Ike's chief of staff, said, slapping a report on the desk. "Taken another town?" Ike asked, pouring coffee. "No." Slapped a soldier. Eisenhower froze. "What?" "2 soldiers, actually," Smith said. "In a field hospital. He called them cowards. He waved his pistol. He threatened to shoot one of them. The doctors represent. Well, they say he was foaming at the mouth, Ike. They say he's unbalanced." Eisenhower sank into his chair. He rubbed his temples. This was the Patton problem. On the battlefield, Patton was a genius. He had an instinct for war that couldn't be taught. He could smell weakness in the enemy line. But off the battlefield, he was a liability. He was a feudal lord in a modern war. "The press is going to eat us alive," Eisenhower muttered. "Drew Pearson is going to broadcast this." "You have to fire him, Ike," Smith said. "Marshall will support you. Send him home. He's a relic." Eisenhower looked at the map of Italy. He looked at the fortifications the Germans were building. He knew that the invasion of Europe overlord was coming. He knew he would need a commander who could smash through the Atlantic Wall. Bradley was steady. Clark was ambitious. But only Patton terrified the Germans. "I can't fire him," Eisenhower said softly. "Why not?" "He's a PR nightmare." "Because," Eisenhower said, "I have to win this war, and I can't win it without a madman." Eisenhower wrote a letter to Patton. It was the harshest letter he ever wrote to a friend. He ordered Patton to apologize to the soldiers, to the doctors, and to every unit in his army. He stripped Patton of his command of the 7th Army. When Patton received the letter, he wept. He stood in front of his troops, a humble giant, and apologized. Eisenhower thought he had broken the wild horse. He thought he had tamed him. He was wrong. August 1944.
France.
The breakout. Patton was back. Eisenhower had brought him out of the doghouse to command the Third Army, and Patton was repaying the favor by tearing the Wehrmacht apart. His tanks were moving so fast that the maps couldn't keep up. He was bypassing resistance, ignoring flanks, and driving straight for the German border. Eisenhower was at his headquarters in Granville, trying to manage the logistics. The Allied armies were drinking gasoline like water. There wasn't enough fuel to supply everyone. Montgomery wanted fuel for the north. Bradley wanted fuel for the center. Patton wanted it all. The phone rang. It was Patton. "Ike!" Patton shouted. The connection was crackly, but the energy was palpable. "I'm at the Seine. I can see Paris. Give me the gas, Ike. Give me 400,000 gallons. And I'll be in Berlin in 6 weeks." "George," Eisenhower said patiently, "you're overextended. You have no flank protection. If the Germans counterattack, to hell with the flank," Patton roared. "I don't need a flank. The Germans are running. I can smell their fear. Don't stop me now, Ike. Don't let Monty steal the glory." Eisenhower looked at the supply charts. He knew Patton was right about the momentum, but he also knew the logistics were impossible. If he gave Patton the gas, Montgomery would stall. The British would be furious. The politics of the alliance would fracture. "Halt, George," Eisenhower ordered. "That is a direct order. You will halt at the Meuse." There was a silence on the line. A heavy, breathing silence. "You are making a mistake," Patton said, his voice dropping to a growl. "You are trading victory for safety. You are letting them escape." "I am running a war, George, not a horse race," Eisenhower snapped. "Hold your position." Patton slammed the phone down. Eisenhower stared at the receiver. He felt a knot in his stomach. He admired Patton's fire. He envied it. Eisenhower was the desk general, the man who had to worry about tonnage and treaties. Patton was the warrior poet, living the war Eisenhower had trained for but could never fight. "He thinks I'm jealous of him," Eisenhower told Bedell Smith later that night. "Are you?" Smith asked.
Eisenhower lit a cigarette.
He watched the smoke curl up to the ceiling. "Sometimes," Eisenhower admitted, "sometimes I wish I could just get in a tank and drive. But someone has to be the grown-up." May 1945. The end of the war. The Germans surrendered. The killing stopped. The concentration camps were liberated. Eisenhower toured one of the camps, Ohrdruf, with Patton. The smell of death was overpowering. Bodies were stacked like cordwood. The SS guards had been killed by the inmates. Eisenhower walked through the horror with a grim face. He wanted to see it so he could testify that it had really happened. Patton, the man of blood and guts, the man who loved war, walked behind him. And suddenly, Patton bent over and vomited. The tough guy cracked. The man who had slapped a soldier for nerves couldn't handle the industrial reality of the Holocaust. Eisenhower looked at Patton, wiping his mouth with a handkerchief. He saw the fragility beneath the bluster. "It's not glorious, is it, George?" Eisenhower said softly. "It's hell," Patton whispered. "It's pure hell." But as the shock wore off, Patton's mind turned to the next enemy, the Soviet Union. The Red Army was occupying Eastern Europe. They were stripping factories, arresting dissidents. Patton saw them not as allies, but as the new Mongols. At a dinner party in Frankfurt, Patton raised a glass. The room was full of Russian generals and American diplomats. "We shouldn't be drinking with these bastards," Patton announced loudly. "We should be fighting them. We have the army here. We have the weapons. Let's kick the Red Army back to Russia before they take over the world." The room went dead silent. Eisenhower pulled Patton aside. His face was purple with rage. "Have you lost your mind?" Eisenhower hissed. "We are weary. The world is destroyed. The American people want to go home. And you want to start World War III tonight. It's inevitable, Ike," Patton argued. "They are going to attack us eventually. Why not fight them now while we're strong? You're letting them take half of Europe." "You are relieved," Eisenhower said coldly. I am taking the Third Army away from you. You are going to command a paper army. The 15th Army. You are done, George. I can't protect you anymore. That was the break. The final rupture. Patton was exiled to a desk job, overseeing the writing of the history of the war. He was a caged lion, pacing, muttering, writing letters to his wife about how Eisenhower was a politician who had sold out to the Bolsheviks. And then came the accident. 1946. The funeral. Patton died in December 1945. He was buried in Luxembourg, among his soldiers. Eisenhower didn't go to the funeral. He was the chief of staff of the army now. He was in Washington. He told the press that he couldn't leave his duties. But the truth was more complicated. He couldn't face the ghost. He couldn't face the guilt. He felt that he had killed Patton, not with a car, but by taking away his purpose, by caging him, by silencing him. In the years that followed, Eisenhower rose to the pinnacle of power. He became the President of the United States. He built the interstate highway system, inspired by the German autobahns he had seen with Patton. He navigated the Cold War. But the name Patton was always there, a whisper. Critics said Eisenhower was too passive. They said he let the Soviets take Eastern Europe. They said Patton would have stopped it. Eisenhower never responded to these critics. He kept his counsel. He wrote his memoirs, Crusade in Europe, in which he praised Patton's tank tactics but subtly criticized his lack of discipline. He painted a portrait of Patton as a brilliant but flawed child, a man who needed a babysitter. And Eisenhower, the great babysitter, took the credit for harnessing him. But deep down, in the private moments of the night, Eisenhower wondered. He wondered if the madman had seen something the statesman had missed. 1965. Gettysburg Farm. 20 years had passed since the war. Eisenhower was an old man now. His heart was failing. He spent his days at his farm in Gettysburg, painting landscapes and watching the cows. He was no longer the most powerful man in the world. He was just Ike. One afternoon, a historian came to visit. He was writing a biography of Patton. He wanted to know the truth. "General," the historian asked, "you and Patton, you were like brothers. But in the end, you destroyed him. Do you regret it?" Eisenhower sat on his porch. He looked out at the fields of Gettysburg, where another war had been fought a century ago. He thought about the slapping incident. He thought about the gas he denied him. He thought about the warning about Russia. "Regret is a useless emotion for a soldier," Eisenhower said initially, falling back on his standard deflection. But was he right? The historian pressed. About the Russians? About the end of the war? Eisenhower turned his head. His eyes, usually so friendly, were dark and distant. This was the moment, the admission. "Turn off the tape recorder," Eisenhower said. The historian clicked the machine off. Eisenhower took a breath. The air smelled of cut grass and memory. "George," Eisenhower began, his voice shaking slightly. George was a difficult man. He was vain. He was cruel at times. He was impossible. He paused. "But the thing I never admitted, the thing I couldn't admit while I was president," Eisenhower leaned forward, "is that I didn't just fire him because he was a liability. I fired him because he was my conscience." The historian sat stunned. "Your conscience, General?" "He saw the world in black and white," Eisenhower whispered. "I lived in the gray. I had to. Politics is gray. But in war, sometimes you need the black and white. George saw the Soviet threat before any of us. He saw that we were shaking hands with the devil. I told him to shut up. I told him he was crazy." Eisenhower looked at his hands, hands that had signed the orders sending millions of men to battle. "But look at the world now," Eisenhower said. "The Iron Curtain, the nuclear standoff, Vietnam." George predicted it all in 1945. He wanted to finish the job. "I stopped him. Because you had to," the historian said gently. "The public wouldn't have supported another war." "Maybe," Eisenhower said. "Or maybe I just didn't have the stomach for it. Maybe I was tired of the killing." And George was never tired of the killing. Eisenhower stood up slowly. He walked to the edge of the porch. I loved him, Eisenhower admitted. And I hated him, because he was the part of me I had to kill to become president. To be the peacemaker, I had to destroy the warrior. He turned back to the historian. You can write that down now, Eisenhower said, but don't publish it until I'm dead. This was the beginning of the final truth. But there was more. The story of what happened in the days immediately following Patton's death. The secret letters, the missing diaries, was a chapter Eisenhower had buried even deeper. To understand the full scope of the admission, we have to go back to the moment the casket was lowered into the ground in Luxembourg. December 24, 1945. Luxembourg. The earth was frozen solid. The grave diggers had to use pickaxes to break the ground at the Ham American Cemetery. It was Christmas Eve, but there were no carols, only the dull thud of steel against ice and the muffled sobbing of 5,000 soldiers. General George S. Patton was going into the ground. Beatrice Patton, his widow, stood by the grave. She was a small woman with a spine of steel, the only person George had ever truly feared. She wore a heavy black veil, but beneath it, her eyes were scanning the crowd of dignitaries. She was looking for one man.
Dwight D. Eisenhower.
He wasn't there. The Supreme Commander, the man George had called his brother, had sent a wreath. He had sent his condolences. He had sent his deputies. But he hadn't come himself. Coward, Beatrice whispered. The wind whipped the word away, but the colonel standing next to her heard it. He pretended he didn't. Beatrice knew why Ike wasn't there. It wasn't because of duties in Washington. It was because George was dangerous even in death, especially in death. The Black Book. 2 weeks later, Washington, D.C. Beatrice was packing George's effects. The trunks had arrived from Europe. His pistols, his riding crop, his medals, and his diaries. George Patton wrote everything down. He kept a black book, a daily journal of his rawest thoughts. He wrote about the incompetence of the British, the cowardice of the politicians, and, most dangerously, his hatred of the Russians. There was a knock at the door. It was General Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's hatchet man. Smith looked uncomfortable. He held his cap in his hands. Mrs. Patton, Smith said, I am here on behalf of General Eisenhower. We need to discuss the papers. The papers? Beatrice asked, her voice cold. The general's diaries, Smith said. As you know, George held sensitive command positions. His journals contain classified information regarding Allied strategy and personal opinions about our Soviet allies. Our Soviet friends, Beatrice corrected mockingly. That's what I calls them, isn't it? Smith stiffened. The War Department is concerned that if those diaries were to be published, in their raw form, it would damage national security. It could provoke an international incident with Moscow. So you want to burn them, Beatrice said. We want to review them, Smith said, to classify them, for the good of the country. Beatrice walked over to the trunk. She placed her hand on the leather-bound volumes. She knew what was in them. George had written that Eisenhower was a politician, not a soldier. He had written that the lack of fuel in 1944 was a deliberate sabotage to prolong the war. He had written that the Russians were Mongol savages who would destroy Europe. If these words got out now, in 1946, while the world was trying to build the United Nations, it would be a disaster. Eisenhower's reputation would be tarnished. The peace would be shattered. George told me you would come, Beatrice said softly. Smith blinked. He did. He said, when I'm dead, Ike will try to sanitize me. He'll try to turn me into a statue. Don't let him. Let me be the monster. Beatrice picked up the diaries. For a moment, Smith thought she was going to hand them over. Instead, she locked the trunk and put the key in her pocket. Tell Ike, Beatrice said, that he can have these diaries over my dead body. History belongs to the victors, General Smith. But the truth belongs to George. Smith left empty-handed. But the war for Patton's legacy had just begun. Eisenhower couldn't destroy the diaries, so he did the next best thing. He destroyed the credibility of the man who wrote them. 1948. The chill sets in. 3 years passed. Eisenhower was now a civilian president of Columbia University. He wore suits instead of uniforms. He was being courted by both political parties to run for president. But the world was changing, just as Patton had predicted. The Soviet friends were no longer friendly. The Iron Curtain had descended. Czechoslovakia had fallen to a communist coup. Poland was a police state, and now the Russians had blockaded Berlin, starving the city. Eisenhower sat in his office at Columbia, reading the newspaper.
Berlin starving. Stalin threatens war.
He put the paper down. He walked to the window looking out over New York City. He heard a voice, a raspy, high-pitched voice. I told you so, Ike. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a memory so vivid it felt like a ghost. He remembered the argument in Frankfurt in 1945. Patton. We have to fight them now. We have the Third Army. We can drive them back to the Volga. Eisenhower. You're crazy, George. The public won't stand for it. Now, looking at the headlines, Eisenhower felt a cold knot of dread. If they had fought then, if they had listened to the madman, would the world be safer? Or would it be a nuclear wasteland? The phone rang. It was General Lucius Clay, the commander in Berlin. Ike, Clay said, we're in trouble. The Russians have cut the roads. We have two choices. We break through with tanks, or we surrender the city. No tanks, Eisenhower said instinctively. If you send tanks, you start World War III. We don't have the stomach for it, Lucius. Then what do? We fly, Eisenhower said. We airlift the supplies. We feed the city from the sky. We show them we are stubborn, but we don't shoot first. It was the statesman decision. It was the safe decision. It was the right decision. But as he hung up the phone, Eisenhower looked at the photo of Patton on his bookshelf. You would have sent the tanks, wouldn't you, you son of a bitch? Eisenhower whispered. He knew the answer. Patton would have smashed the blockade. He would have started the war. And maybe, just maybe, he would have won it before the Soviets got the atomic bomb. But the Soviets were getting the bomb. The window was closing. Patton's preventative war was no longer an option. The long, dark winter of the Cold War had begun, the very winter Patton had tried to prevent. 1952. The editing room. Eisenhower decided to run for president. He needed to secure his legacy. He published his memoirs, Crusade in Europe. It became a bestseller. It established the narrative of World War II that we know today. The noble crusade, the Allied unity, the triumph of democracy. But behind the scenes, there was a struggle over the text. Eisenhower sat with his ghostwriters in a smoke-filled room. They were going over the draft chapters about Patton. General, one writer said, this section where Patton criticizes the fuel shortage. It makes you look like you favored Montgomery. Should we keep it? Eisenhower looked at the text. It was the truth. He had favored Montgomery for political reasons. Cut it, Eisenhower said. Change it to logistical difficulties due to the speed of advance. And this part, the writer continued, where Patton wants to arm the German POWs to fight the Russians. It makes him look, well, insane. Leave that, Eisenhower said, but frame it as battle fatigue. Make it sound like he was exhausted. Don't make it sound like a policy proposal. He was curating the ghost. He was turning Patton into a caricature, a brilliant but unhinged tactician who needed Eisenhower's steady hand to guide him. He was robbing Patton of his intellectual weight to preserve his own political viability. He felt a pang of guilt. He was erasing his friend's mind to save his own reputation. But then he remembered the slapping incident. He remembered the anti-Semitic comments Patton had made in private. He remembered the chaos. I am doing him a favor, Eisenhower told himself. I am remembering the hero and burying the monster. 1953. The Oval Office. President Eisenhower sat at the resolute desk. The room was quiet. It was late. He was the most powerful man on earth. He had ended the Korean War. He was managing the nuclear arms race. His secretary buzzed him. Mr. President, there is a package for you. Personal. Eisenhower opened the envelope. Inside was a small, leather-bound notebook. It was old, battered, stained with water and oil. There was a note attached. It was from Beatrice Patton. She had died a few weeks earlier, falling from a horse, a warrior's death, just like George would have wanted. The note read, "I kept this safe for 8 years. I didn't publish it. I didn't want to hurt the country. But now that I'm gone, I want you to have it. Read it, and tell me if you can sleep at night. B." Eisenhower opened the book. It was one of the missing diaries, the one from 1945. He started to read. The handwriting was jagged, angry. August 1945. Ike is running for president. I can smell it. He is selling out the army to please the voters. He is letting the Russians rape Berlin because he doesn't want to rock the boat. He has no soul. He is a hollow man. He wants peace so badly he will let the devil own half the world. Eisenhower turned the page. October 1945. I told Ike today that we are fighting the wrong enemy. He looked at me like I was a mad dog. Maybe I am. But a mad dog bites the burglar. A lap dog licks his hand. Ike is a lap dog with stars on his shoulder. Eisenhower slammed the book shut. His hands were shaking. "Lap dog," he whispered. He stood up and walked to the fireplace. A fire was crackling in the hearth. He held the diary over the flames. This was the evidence. This was the voice of the man who knew him better than anyone. The man who saw his ambition and called it cowardice. If he burned it, the words disappeared. The criticism vanished. But he couldn't do it. He was a soldier. He respected the enemy. And in the end, Patton had been his greatest enemy, the enemy of his conscience. He pulled the book back from the fire. He placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk, locked it, and put the key in his pocket. He sat back down. He looked at the map of the world on the wall. The red stain of the Soviet Union covered half the globe. "You were right, George," Eisenhower said to the empty room. "You were right about the Russians." He picked up a pen to sign a document authorizing the development of the U-2 spy plane, a tool to look behind the Iron Curtain that Patton had wanted to tear down. "But you were wrong about me," Ike added softly. "I'm not a lapdog. I'm a watchdog, and I have to stay awake all night so the world doesn't end." He thought the conversation was over. He thought admitting Patton was right about the Soviets was the final hurdle. But the ghost wasn't done with him yet. There was one more secret, one more admission that Eisenhower had never spoken aloud, not even to Mamie, not even to himself. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about strategy. It was about the day Patton died. The accident, the truck, the broken neck. Rumors had swirled for years that it wasn't an accident, that the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, had arranged it, that Wild Bill Donovan wanted Patton silenced before he could start a war with Russia. Eisenhower had always dismissed these as conspiracy theories, but there was a memory that nagged at him, a memory of a conversation he had with Bedell Smith 3 days before the accident. A conversation where Smith had said, "George is out of control, Ike. He's going to speak to the press when he gets back to the States. He's going to blow the lid off everything." And Eisenhower had replied with 4 words, 4 words that he had buried under layers of denial. He unlocked the drawer again. He looked at the diary. He realized that the real burden wasn't what Patton had written about him. It was what he had felt when he heard the news of the crash. Relief. March 28, 1969. Walter Reed Army Medical Center. The room was dimly lit. The oxygen machine hissed rhythmically, a mechanical counterpoint to the failing heartbeat of the 34th President of the United States. Dwight D. Eisenhower was dying. His heart, which had survived the stress of D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Cold War, was finally surrendering. He was 78 years old. His skin was translucent like parchment paper. The room was filled with family, his son John, his wife Mamie. But in the corner, sitting quietly in a chair, was the historian. The same man who had visited Gettysburg 4 years earlier. Eisenhower had summoned him. "John," Eisenhower rasped, waving his hand weakly at his son. "Leave us. A moment." "Dad, you need to rest," John said gently. "I have plenty of time." To rest, Eisenhower whispered. Go. The family filed out. The door clicked shut. The historian moved his chair closer to the bed. He saw the desperation in the general's eyes. This wasn't a history lesson anymore. It was a confessional. You came back, Eisenhower said. You asked me to, General. Eisenhower closed his eyes. The morphine was clouding his mind, dragging him back and forth through time. One moment he was in Washington. The next he was in a muddy tent in Tunisia. I told you, Eisenhower said. His voice stronger now, fueled by a final burst of adrenaline. I told you that George was my conscience. That I fired him to save the peace. Yes, sir. I lied, Eisenhower said. The historian froze. Sir, it wasn't just the peace, Eisenhower said. He turned his head on the pillow, staring at the ceiling as if looking through it to the sky. It was the relief. That's the sin. The relief. The memory. December 10th, 1945. Eisenhower closed his eyes, and the hospital room dissolved. He was back in his office in Frankfurt. It was snowing outside. The phone rang. It was Bedell Smith. Ike, Smith said. There's been an accident. George, a car wreck near Mannheim. Is he dead? Eisenhower asked. No. Broken neck. Paralyzed. The doctors say. They say he probably won't walk again. He might not make it. Eisenhower remembered the physical sensation that washed over him in that moment. It wasn't grief. It wasn't shock. It was the feeling of a heavy pack being lifted off his shoulders. For months, he had been terrified of what Patton would do when he returned to the United States. Patton had threatened to resign his commission. He had threatened to go on a speaking tour. He was going to tell the American people that the war was fought wrongly, that the Russians were the enemy, that Eisenhower was a political hack. Patton was a loose cannon aimed directly at Eisenhower's future. But a paralyzed Patton? A dying Patton? A dying Patton was a hero, a martyr, a legend, a statue. Safe. Ike, Smith asked on the phone. Are you there? I'm here, Eisenhower said. Send the best doctors. Do everything you can. But he remembered the thought that flashed through his mind. Unbidden, cruel, and undeniable. It's better this way. The investigation. Back in the hospital room, Eisenhower gripped the historian's wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. There were rumors, Eisenhower whispered. You know them. That the truck driver was paid. That the OSS did it. That the Russians did it. Conspiracy theories, General, the historian said soothingly. I could have stopped them, Eisenhower said. I was the supreme commander. I could have ordered a full inquiry. I could have turned Germany upside down to find out why a truck turned left in front of the only empty road in Europe. Why didn't you? Because I didn't want to know, Eisenhower admitted. If it was an accident, it was a tragedy. If it was murder, then I would have to avenge him. I would have to start a war. And I didn't want a war. I wanted to go home. Tears welled up in the old general's eyes. I let him die not because I hated him, but because he was inconvenient. He was the last warrior in a world that needed politicians. And I chose to be the politician. The vision. The room grew darker. The historian scribbled furiously in his notebook, knowing he was capturing the final secret of the 20th century. Eisenhower's breathing became shallow. He was drifting again. He saw George. Not the broken man in the hospital bed, but the George of 1944. Standing in a jeep, ivory-handled pistols at his waist, dust on his goggles, screaming at a mule train to get out of the way. Alive, vibrant, dangerous. He called me a lap dog, Eisenhower muttered. Sir, in his diary, he called me a lap dog. He said I had no soul. Eisenhower looked at the historian. Was he right? Look at the world we built. The Cold War.
Koreo. Vietnam.
We traded a hot war for 40 years of fear. George would have finished it in 1945. He would have pushed the Red Army back to the borders. Millions of people in Poland, in Hungary, in Czech. They would have been free. And millions would have died, General, the historian countered. It would have been a slaughter. Yes, Eisenhower sighed. But George didn't care about death. He cared about victory. I cared about life. And because of that, we lived in fear. The absolution. Eisenhower's hand relaxed. He let go of the historian's wrist. I miss him, Eisenhower whispered. I miss him every day. I miss his fire. I was the ice, you see? I was the ice that kept the world from burning up. But ice is cold. And lonely. He looked at the door where Mamie was waiting. I never visited his grave, Eisenhower said. Did you know that? I knew. I couldn't. I couldn't stand there and look at the cross and know that I was the one who put him there. Not by killing him, but by not saving him. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. When I get to the other side, Eisenhower said, a faint smile touching his lips. He'll be waiting. He'll be standing at the gates. And he'll be mad as hell. What will you tell him, General? Eisenhower closed his eyes for the last time. The peace he had fought so hard to keep finally settled over his face. I'll tell him he was right, Eisenhower whispered. And then I'll tell him to shut up and get in the Jeep. We have a war to win. The aftermath. Dwight D. Eisenhower died minutes later. The state funeral was magnificent. Kings and presidents came to pay their respects. They praised him as the liberator of Europe, the peacemaker, the architect of the West. But in the archives, the Black Book diaries of George Patton remained locked away, sanitized, their raw fury kept from the public eye. The historian finished his book. But he honored the general's request. He didn't publish the final admission for years. When the story finally came out, it changed the way historians looked at the two men. It wasn't just a story of a partnership. It was a Greek tragedy. Cain and Abel, the pragmatist and the crusader. Patton was the man who could win the war, but could not survive the peace. Eisenhower was the man who could build the peace, but had to kill a part of himself to do it. Epilogue. The Luxembourg Cemetery. Today, if you go to the Ham American Cemetery in Luxembourg, you will see 5,076 crosses arranged in perfect geometric arcs. At the head of the formation, separate from the others, facing his men, is the grave of General George S. Patton, Jr. He lies there, eternal, watching over his troops. And if you listen closely to the wind blowing through the trees of the Ardennes, you might hear a ghostly voice, raspy and high-pitched, cursing the politicians, demanding more gas, and asking why the hell the army stopped at the Elbe. Eisenhower built the modern world. But Patton? Patton is the ghost that haunts it, reminding us that sometimes the safe choice is the one that leaves the deepest scars. The accident remains a mystery. The diaries remain a testament. But the friendship, the broken, beautiful, terrible friendship between Ike and Georgie, remains the heartbeat of the war that saved the world. And in the end, Ike admitted the truth. He didn't just lose a friend. He lost the only man who had the courage to tell him he was wrong. The end.